Hello, class. Today we're starting a new chapter, Chapter 7, Confederation and Constitution, and we are a little behind, so we're going to quickly move through at least the beginning of this chapter so we can get on to bigger and better things. All right. The colonies had just defeated a tyrannical government, a very strong government that could do whatever it wanted, and what it wanted to do is mistreat its people. So the people are obviously afraid to have a strong government in case the new American government is just as bad as the old British one. So they form what's called a confederation, where every state is going to work together, but no state could tell another state what to do. And the central government could not control the states either to give more freedom. This man's name is John Dickinson. He was a very important founding father, and he wrote our first constitution called the Articles of Confederation way back in '77. This is during the American Revolution. They're already considering what our government ought to look like after the Revolution. And they decided there would be just one governing body. So today we have three parts of government. We have Congress, we have the President, and we have the Supreme Court. Well, back then there was one part of government, just this Congress. There would be elections every single year. Now today our president is elected every 4 years, our senators every 6 years, and our representatives every 2 years. Well, back then, elections every single year. And every state doesn't try to do what's best for the country. They try to do what's best for itself. It's going to lead to some problems. Every state had to ratify or agree to the Articles of Confederation before they actually became the nation's law. And that took about 4 years for every state to decide to obey the Articles of Confederation. The biggest argument is what to do about Western land. So if you recall, the king said we're only allowed to go up to the Appalachian Mountains right here. But then after the war, we got all the land on this side of the Mississippi. So now there's a ton of extra land that America owns. And which state gets that land? A lot of states argue that they should get all the land west of their current border. So if you look here, South Carolina today is only about that big. But back then they said, we want all the land to the Mississippi. Here's North Carolina. We want all the land to the Mississippi. Look how much Virginia is asking for. Well, that's not a terrible idea for the states down here, but what about New England states? What about like Massachusetts and New York? Who gets the land to the west? It was all a big mess. And there's some tiny states up here like Rhode Island that are now going to be a tiny fraction of these gigantic states like Virginia and South Carolina. And they did not want those other states to have too much power over them. Well, in the end, they decided that their central government, the new Continental Congress, would be able to decide what to do with it. And Congress decided to make new states out of that Western land, not give it to any of these states. That's why we do not have states in this shape today. We have new states over here like Tennessee, Kentucky. This new Congress under the Articles of Confederation had very, very little power. Remember, we're scared of a powerful government that might oppress us. They were not allowed to tax people. Only states were allowed to tax. That makes sense considering the revolution was largely about unfair taxes. What could Congress do? They could raise an army. But how do you hire soldiers if you don't have any money? That's a problem. You'd have to ask pretty please for money. Not very effective. They could declare war. The states are not allowed to declare war by themselves. Only the central government can declare war for everyone. They could also make peace treaties, makes sense. Manage Indian affairs, buy and sell land from the Indians. Run the post office because the mail is going from state to state to state. They want to make sure the rules are all the same in every state. That makes sense. And they can make and borrow money, but interestingly, every state was allowed to make their own money too. So we don't have one American money. We have dozens of different kinds of money, and that's kind of strange. A lot of the things Congress could do could also be done by states. Every state could print its own money. Here's some money printed before the American Revolution, but in 1764 by Benjamin Franklin. Very interesting. He was printing money before the American Revolution. Notice they were very interested in counterfeiting. Counterfeiting is making your own money and printing off your own money. It says to counterfeit is death, a 12-shilling note. By the way, who can tell me what kind of leaf this is? That's right. It's a tobacco leaf. Because remember, tobacco is often used as money, especially in the South. Here's a state of New Hampshire piece of money. Notice that you can give this bill, this piece of paper, to the bank, and you will be paid one Spanish milled dollar. They will give you a gold coin. Back then, all paper money stood for actual gold and silver money. By the way, the Spanish word for money was dollar, and that's because Spain had a massive colony in Mexico and in Southern America that made a bunch of gold coins, and that's why America uses dollars today instead of the British pound sterling, because most of our coins were made in Spain. Here is another piece of paper money. Tis death to counterfeit. They're very serious about that. Here's Maryland. This indented bill of $1 shall entitle the bearer to receive bills of exchange in London or gold and silver. So you can actually exchange this piece of paper for gold and silver. Can't do that today. Each state could make its own debt, go into debt and make its own treaties. And a couple states even said we have the power to declare war by themselves. But of course, that never did happen. The states could do several things Congress could not. They controlled all trade laws, domestic and international, and they had the exclusive rights to tax. Only states were allowed to tax, not the central government, remember, because we're afraid of the central government. Congress can only pass a law if about 3/4 of the states agreed to that law. Can you imagine if Congress today could only write laws if people agreed to follow them? It's not how we do it today. Today in Congress, you only need 51% of the voters in Congress to vote yes, and then that's law. Back then, 3/4. The articles could only be, like their constitution, could only be amended or changed if every single state agreed to it. And of course, we don't do that today. So the Articles of Confederation only lasted 8 years before we have our new modern constitution that we use today. But they actually did several really important things. Probably the most important thing is what to do with all that new land, make new states out of it, because we actually use the same process to make new states today. In 1785, they passed this law called the Northwest Ordinance of 1785, which is basically what to do with all this brand new land that no state owns. They decided that whenever we get new land, that will always belong to the central government, not to any single state. I thought that was more fair that way. The central government said, instead of taxing people and making money, why don't we just sell all this land that we have, and that's how we're going to pay for our government. That way only the people who are buying land are giving money to the government, and the rest of you don't have to pay taxes to us. That's pretty nice. And the Northwest Ordinance divided all this new territory into places they call townships that are 6-mile square pieces of land. And every township is divided into 1 square mile sections, and that makes 36 sections. And then those sections could be divided into halves or quarters, and you were allowed to buy half a section or 1 section. I think at first there were restrictions to how much land you could buy, but then later on they could say you could buy extra if you want. And then they just subdivided those towns and said every town can elect its own mayor, that kind of thing. Plot 16, the sale of that would go to paying for education and stuff. Congress kept the prices very, very low. They could have, made a fortune off this, and they decided to keep prices low because they want people to move out west. We want to grow the country. We want to encourage people from Europe to come to America and make our country large and prosperous. Some large companies, as soon as they were allowed to, bought tons and tons and tons of land, millions of acres, and then sold that later on when the price of land went up. They sold that at a big profit. Congress tried to buy a lot of that land from the natives, and a lot of the time that did work out well, and the Indians just slowly moved further west. Some of the times, of course, we ran into trouble and wars and all sorts of unpleasantness. 2 years later, they passed another law called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and this told you how to become a state once there are enough people there. Every territory would have its own governor, its own judges, and its own secretary, and Congress would be in charge of giving those people their government. When it got large enough, then they were allowed to vote for their own officials. And when you get up to 60,000 people, they could write their own state constitution and apply for statehood. So all they had to do is write a nice constitution and then ask Congress to become a state. And if Congress voted yes, then they could become a state. And we used pretty much that exact same method for all the new states. As soon as you get to X number of people, and I think that number has changed over the years, not 60,000. That's very low for today. So when you get to X number of people, you write your own constitution, you send it into Congress for approval, and then Congress gets a vote on whether or not to let you in to be a state. The very first state admitted to the Union was Vermont. Vermont was the 14th state after the original 13. And the very last state admitted was Hawaii. Alaska and Hawaii were both admitted in, was it 59? Not that long ago. This law guaranteed a couple things. First of all, every new state would have a Republican form of government. That just means that every state has to have the people vote on its leaders, and that's all it means. Your state government can be very different from the person next to you, but in every state, you have to vote for your governor, your representatives, your senators, those kinds of people. Every new state must have freedom of religion, and no new states are allowed to have slaves. That's very important. A lot of the founding fathers were against slavery. Another interesting thing Congress did is they kept all their doings public. Every once in a while, they would tell the newspapers, a list of everything they discussed and a list of votes and who voted yes and who voted no. They wanted the people to know what their representatives were doing in government. This is very different from the British style. Sometimes the British people just did whatever they wanted and the government never told you why. Well, our people wanted to be very transparent so that if you dislike the way your person voted, you can kick them out of office and vote for someone else. And we do that exact same thing today. In fact, you can go online. You could probably do this right now. Go to C-SPAN, the letter C, S-P-A-N. C-SPAN has video cameras in Congress, and they just broadcast everything Congress does. You could just Google Senate or watch Senate live or watch Congress live or something. I don't know if they're doing anything right now. They might be discussing a bill right now. They might be voting on something right now, or it could be empty. Just Google watch Congress live and see what's happening. And of course, if you want to know which way people voted on different things, you can just Google it, and they keep that very public. For instance, there was a new infrastructure bill paying for roads and stuff. And why don't you Google, Congress infrastructure bill votes and see which way people from Maine voted? You could do that if you want. Nothing's secret. They also use the decimal system for money. That is ones and tens. English money was really crazy. They had 4 different kinds of money: farthings, pennies, shillings, and pounds. Farthings, pennies, shillings, and pounds. 4 farthings equals 1 penny, 12 pennies or pence equals 1 shilling, and 20 shillings equals 1 pound. That's confusing. So you know how we can say like $1.50, $1.50? They wouldn't do that. They would do like $1.568 for a 1 pound, 5 shillings, 6 pence, and 8 farthings, or something crazy like that. So they can't just do $1.50. They so much thinking complicated. Why? We said we're gonna have 2 types of money: dollars and cents. 100 cents equals $1. It is really easy to do the math with the decimal system. What is half a pound? 10 shillings. Well, what's half a pound in pence? That's a lot of pence. I don't know. Well, what's half a dollar? 50 cents. What's a quarter of a dollar? 25 cents. We only have dollars and pennies. We don't have farthings or shillings or anything like that. We have very easy coins to count. We have 5-cent coins, 10-cent coins, 25-cent coins, and you could do the math on those pretty easily. At least, I hope you can. What are some weaknesses of the Confederation? Well, one weakness is, even though Congress got to wrote laws, they could not enforce the laws that they passed. They did not have the ability to force people to obey the law. If someone broke the law, they cannot throw them in jail. They have no police force. They have no judges. States do. So if you break a state law, the state police can arrest you and the state judges can throw you in jail, but not the central government. I would say DC, but it's not DC. DC isn't built yet. They were in Philadelphia. They could not make you obey. They could just ask you to obey. There was no president or executive branch that forced you to obey. There was no judge that could throw you in jail or fine you if you disobey, which really meant that if a state, if the whole state wanted to ignore Congress and disobey, they could, and Congress could do nothing about it. If an individual wanted to disobey, there's really nothing they could do about it. What's the point of having a rule if nobody's following the rule? Really not very effective. Congress had lots of money problems, especially because they could not tax. They could just ask pretty please for money. And usually when you ask a state for money, the state says no thanks. If Congress says, I need $100,000 right now, the state might say, oh, I'll give you $20,000. I think that's all you need. And that's just not effective. Congress can't do its job without the money that it needs. They couldn't run the government or pay war debts, including veterans. Guys, there were people who risked their lives for their country, who fought in the revolution for several years and never saw a penny for it. And now, 5, 6, 7 years after the war, they still haven't been paid for their service. And that is a big problem. If they risk their lives to make America free, they deserve at least to get paid. And they weren't promised very much money at all, but they were promised pay, and they hadn't gotten it years later. And that's because Congress has to ask for money, and the states say, no, we're not going to give you that money. Every state had different trade laws, and that was just really confusing. Imagine if, every one of the 50 states had to make a separate trade deal with China. That's just a massive headache. And trade makes a lot of money. So whatever slows down trade is really bad for the economy. Gold and silver were very scarce, so every state made its own paper money, and that meant no one really wanted everyone else's paper money, and money was not very valuable. That's a problem. Further problems with England, the peace treaty at the end of the Revolution said that all English soldiers would leave, and then America would pay off its debts to England. Well, because America can't pay its debts, they kept all their soldiers in America, not in America, but in the Western forts, which is now American territory. So there's still thousands of British soldiers watching us. They're not leaving. And of course, both sides are mad because neither side is really obeying the peace treaty. Now, England is getting frustrated that they're not getting money. So what are they going to do about it? They start stopping American ships and stealing American cargo to pay for all the debts we owe them. And sometimes they stole sailors too. Guys, back then, the British Navy was really terrible towards its people. They beat them, they paid them very little, it was incredibly hard work, and lots of people ran away from the Navy. So the only way to get sailors was by kidnapping them. So they keep on kidnapping American sailors to force them to work for England. And of course, that makes America very mad. But there's nothing we can do about it because we don't have a navy. So they are attacking our ships, and there's nothing we can do. And that's not good. We couldn't even pay the interest on our debt to France. France loaned us a lot of money, and really, France made us win the war. We would not have won the war without French help. And now we can't even pay pennies. Can't pay a fraction of what we owe to France, and that's making them very angry with us. And then we went to France, and we had the audacity to say, sorry, we can't even pay the interest. Can you give us more money? France is like, no, you owe me money. I don't owe you money. So, of course, we're all mad at France, and they're all mad at us. We also couldn't pay debts back to the Dutch, but we only owe them a little bit of money, and they were much kinder about it. What about Spain? Spain owned New Orleans, big city on the very south end of the Mississippi River. Many Western farmers found it was easier to ship their goods down the Mississippi, around the Gulf of Mexico, and back to like New York and Boston and the big cities on the coast. That was faster than going by wagon across land. And Spain was being mean, and they said, our people can't use the warehouses in their city of New Orleans, which basically meant our farmers can't get their goods to market. So John Jay, remember him, very important founding father, he went to Spain and made a treaty with Spain, allowing us use of New Orleans. However, everyone hated it. They thought John Jay gave too much power to Spain and didn't get enough in return. So Congress refused to ratify it, and it did not become law. And we're just all mad at Spain and not able to use their warehouses. Problems at home. Here's a guy named Daniel Shays who was a veteran who had not been paid. And Massachusetts starts raising taxes really, really high. And a lot of farmers can't afford to pay their taxes, and they're getting really angry. And they said, hey, last time our government was giving unfair taxes, we started a revolution. So this time, when our new government is doing unfair taxes, let's do another revolution. And he led a mob to attack Massachusetts. Now, thankfully, this was put down very quickly. The American army came, and with just one volley, 4 people died, and everyone else went home. This could have been much worse. But this really showed the people you cannot shoot people every time you dislike what the government does. Sometimes the government is unfair. Sometimes the government just goes in a different direction than you want it to. If we had a revolution every time someone was mad at the government, we'd have revolutions every single day. And that's just not a way to run a country. Revolution should be a very, very last resort. Vote first, and only then start a revolution. Just imagine all the people who complain about the government. Thanksgiving's coming. Maybe you have a chance to meet relatives, and politics are usually talked about at Thanksgiving for whatever reason. You're probably going to hear a lot of people angry at the government over the next couple of weeks. But thankfully, they keep their actions to yelling and complaining and maybe Facebook posting and not actually shooting the government. That's no way to run a country. So people are saying, guys, here's a lot of problems with our government. Our government is not strong enough to put down a rebellion, not strong enough to fight England or just demand that they remove their soldiers and respect our ships. We need a stronger central government. I know we were scared of a strong central government, but it needs to be a little bit stronger than it is right now. Make sense? So next time we will look at how we created a new government, the government that we have today, and try to make a balance between a government strong enough to do its job effectively, strong enough to have the money to pay for what it needs to do, but not so strong that it oppresses the people. And it's a very fine balance there. Not too weak, not too strong, but like Goldilocks, just right. We'll talk about that tomorrow. See ya.